David, it's great to see you today.
Good to see you, Jason.
David, you spent years living in Moscow as a foreign correspondent, and you've extensively researched and covered the Putin regime. Now, when you look at the current situation in Kursk and Belgorod, Russia, where Ukrainian soldiers have entered, what do you think will happen? A lot of people here in Ukraine are very concerned that the Russians could do something to discredit the Ukrainians. For instance, by doing a false flag operation, killing, for instance, Russian civilians, and blaming it on Ukrainian soldiers, or blaming a weapon system made by the US or made by Europe as being responsible for Russian civilian deaths. Or Russia could even do something like try to create an explosion at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. So, do you think that those concerns are warranted? Do you think that Vladimir Putin has the capacity to just kill civilians for his own political gain?
Not only does he have the capacity, but he's done it repeatedly throughout his career. I mean, this was how Putin came to power, was as the result of the bombing of civilian apartment buildings in which he and the other members of the leadership were implicated. So it wouldn't be in no way surprising if they were to stage some type of provocation which involved murdering their own citizens. In fact, truthfully, this whole war is an example of their willingness to murder their own citizens because the hundreds of thousands of Russians who are being thrown into that meat grinder do not have complete information and as a result do not have informed freedom of action when it comes to serving in the Russian armed forces. But to focus more narrowly on specific acts of provocation, they've characterized Putin's period in power from the very beginning, including, as I've just said, the means by which he came to power. So it will be nothing out of the ordinary if such a provocation takes place. The other question, however, is whether, given the present circumstances in the Kursk Oblast, it's even to their advantage to use those tactics right now. I think the Ukrainians are right to keep a watchful eye on the situation. But generally speaking, when the Russians stage a massive provocation, it's in order to justify the beginning of a war or to achieve a major geopolitical advantage. For example, the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner in order to stop the Ukrainian counteroffensive against the separatists in 2014. So I'm not sure I see circumstances right now in which a false flag attack would necessarily work to the advantage of the Russians, but I think that the Ukrainians are 100% justified in keeping a watchful eye on the situation.
That's really interesting, David. I wanted to ask you about the subject of one of your books, the Moscow apartment bombings in 1999. Could you talk about that a little bit? What happened in 1999, and what role did that play in Vladimir Putin's ascent to power?
It's kind of sad in a way that we have to even go back and explain to people what happened because this was the most important event of the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century. This was the greatest political provocation since the burning of the Reichstag. Yeltsin was so unpopular that there was a question in Russia whether anyone actually supported him. And it was taken for granted that anyone who he supported would have no chance of acceding to the Russian presidency in the year 2000. It was commonly said at the time, and I heard this, that Yeltsin was ready to blow up half of Moscow in order to protect his corrupt family. And then the explosions began. Apartment buildings began to be blown up in the middle of the night. They were blamed on the Chechens, who had nothing to do with them and have always denied that they had anything to do with them. And that was used as an excuse to start a new war in Chechnya. The war galvanized support for Putin, and a person who was completely unknown, an absolute nobody, whose own, a corrupt functionary from St. Petersburg, whose chief distinction was his close relationship to St. Petersburg organized crime, suddenly became the leading candidate for president. And he was elected on a wave of patriotic fervor as the person who was avenging the perfidious terrorist attack carried out against innocent Russians while they slept, despite the fact that he was part of the operation which blew these people up. It's it's something that for we in the West have a. It's so counterintuitive. It's so unbelievable. It so defies imagination. We can understand that a corrupt leader, an authoritarian leader, will eliminate his political opponents. We can understand that he'll wage aggressive war. We can even understand that he will sacrifice his soldiers in senseless battles, including offensives that make no sense and which he cannot win. But what we can't get our minds around is the idea that the leader of a country would just murder hundreds of randomly selected people in order to create panic and and come to power. But that's what happened, and the evidence for it is overwhelming, and it's incontrovertible. And because it is so counterintuitive, and also because many of our American diplomats, American officials had invested so much in the idea of Yeltsin as the symbol of democracy. We in the US did not take steps to raise the question of why these bombings were taking place and why three FSB agents were arrested in Ryazan when a fifth bomb was discovered that they had placed in a basement, which was defused just before it went off. So the long and short of it is that we are not giving Ukraine the kind of support that it needs and deserves, in part because of our ability to deceive ourselves and our unwillingness to face the truth about Putin and about the Putin regime. Once we do that, and by the way, the 25th anniversary of the apartment bombings is coming up, and we're going to do something in Washington to try to, raise consciousness here. I hope we'll never again have a situation in which vital support to Ukraine is delayed on the grounds that Russia is a Christian country. So it's a sad situation. It shows the lack of imagination and the lack of the willingness to see on the part of the West. But I hold to the hope that the situation is remediable because the facts are all there.
So, David, you've referred to Putin's regime as being like a criminal enterprise, like a mafia. In fact, just now, you point out that Vladimir Putin had very close ties to the criminal organizations of St. Petersburg in the 1990s. Could you explain exactly how the criminal networks of Vladimir Putin's Russia operate in tandem with the Kremlin?
In a way, it's worse than organized crime because it's organized crime with a communist mentality and a communist disregard for the value of human life. The Al Capone in Chicago uh, didn't tolerate attacks on women and children. He said, "You kill only our own." Um, but there's no code of ethics here. There's no moral limitations of any kind. human being is understood in the communist sense as just raw material. Uh, Putin started in St. Petersburg in the as in the as a notorious bribe taker, working as the close deputy to Anatoly Sobchak, who also was massively corrupt, and in cooperation with the Tambov criminal organization, whose leader, Vladimir Putin, was known as the night governor of St. Petersburg. In cooperation with what was left of the KGB, they created a tribute system in St. Petersburg, in which everybody paid them off, in which they channeled uh, business to their corrupt connections and personally enriched themselves. Uh, and that system was eventually uh, spread to the whole of Russia. And it is the system under which Russia is ruled today, and monopolistic control over natural resources. And at the head of this corrupt pyramid is Putin, who serves as the decision maker and arbitrator. And he had a lot of experience doing this in St. Petersburg, by the way, when he was kind of the arbitrator between the criminal organizations who dominated the city and with whom he had close personal and professional relations. And the city's business community, such as it was, and the government. So the rot set in early, and the fate of Ukraine was very much determined by the fact that it became clear to the Russian leadership, especially with the Maidan revolt in 2013, that Ukraine, with its embryonic, imperfect, but nonetheless developing civil society, was a mortal threat to kleptocratic rule in Russia. Because a functioning pro-Western democratic Ukraine would be a massive pole of attraction for Russian society. And Russian society itself is evolving, by the way. Russian society in 2013, when Maidan took place, was not the same as Russian society in 1990, 1991. The years of capitalist development, say what you will, it was achieved at great cost, but it nonetheless created a middle class. It created a group of people who were much more worldly, much more accustomed to traveling, to seeing the outside world, much more oriented toward integration with the West. And that was reflected in 2011 with the revolt again in the wake of the falsified parliamentary elections. Unfortunately, that protest movement petered out in Russia itself, only to resurface with renewed strength in Kyiv, in the form of the Maidan revolt. And this is what worried uh, the Russian leaders, and that's why they needed a massive distraction. In the case of 1999, the massive distraction was the, the bombings and the Second Chechen War. In the case of 2014, it was the attack on Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, the seizure, the fomenting of a separatist revolt in eastern Ukraine, all of which, in both cases, the goal was to distract the Russian people from the real issue, which was the way in which they were being misruled. And the reason for the hatred toward Ukraine, which, by the way, didn't figure in the press much, until 2013, 2014, after Maidan. Before that, you didn't see all this, all these lies about Nazism and fascism. That began only when Ukraine and its civil society became a threat to kleptocratic rule, not just in Ukraine but in Russia. And and using the same playbook from 1999, the regime, which is becoming more lawless, more inefficient, more corrupt, which was losing popular support, uh, turned to a familiar means of strengthening its hold on power, which was an attack on a foreign power, in this case, Ukraine. I mean, we constantly hear that Putin is a great power nationalist, that he wants to restore the Soviet Empire. And of course, and the Russian spokesman at various disinformation forums like the Valdai discussion group, which was used to disinform American policymakers and Russia experts. They went to this completely uncritically, to this so-called discussion club, and repeated Russian disinformation. And they were disinformed in ways they themselves were unaware of, just in the casual conversations in which Russian so-called experts would inform them that Putin is some type of 19th century great power thinker, which is nothing rather than a petty criminal from St. Petersburg. But the reality is that none of this is important. What's important is and this is the tragedy, and this is why Russians and Ukrainians are dying in a senseless war. Senseless from the point of view of Russia, but necessary in the case of Ukraine, to strengthen the hold on power of this corrupt, amoral group. And this is the realization that we all need to have. We need to have this here in the United States, because there's the amount of uninformed discussion of the war and of the stakes in this war is just something terrible. But it's also true, it's important also in Ukraine as well. So Ukrainians understand. I think they do. They do understand intuitively. And I think that in the older generation, certainly there are many who probably, uh, grasp pretty well what's going on. But still, this is, we as journalists, as writers, we have an obligation, I think, to really inform people about what are the stakes in this conflict? What will happen if we don't prevail? Why do we have to make these sacrifices that are so painful? And it's rooted in the horribly dysfunctional situation in Russia, which in the wake of Ukrainian victory could change, by the way. Defeat in war has actually been positive for Russia's democratic development historically. So that's the situation we face.
So, David, just one last question. Looking ahead, what do you anticipate happening to Russia? And what do you think would happen if tomorrow Vladimir Putin were to lose the war in Ukraine? What could we expect to see?
If the front were to collapse, or if uh, well, then all bets are off. All bets are off. Uh, we If things begin to go bad, uh, we don't know the strength of the anti-war sentiment in the leadership. We can presume that it exists. We have some indirect signs of that, including the remarks of Prigozhin before he was killed, or during the revolt, that the war was being fought on false pretenses, that Ukraine never threatened Russia. We know the remarks that were made before the war began by General Ivashko warning about the consequences, we can presume that there are some people in the Russian hierarchy, in the security services or in the military, who are distressed about the horrific losses. But how close are they to being able to remove Putin? I think that it will take a number of things. It will take victories by Ukraine, uh, a change in consciousness on the part of the population, in part by, for example, greater awareness of how Putin came to power, which exists up to a point, but needs to be emphasized, and economic collapse in Russia. They have a Hitler type economy. They're everything is based on further conquest. Sooner or later, they're pouring money into military production and military salaries uh, that has no further application in the economy. This this can't go on forever. And Western sanctions have been ineffectual, but we're studying ways to make them more effectual. So, there are some factors in play that could undermine his position. But the sad thing is that we don't have the information we need to be confident about what's likely to happen. I think that if he is removed, that his successors will make peace and blame everything on him. Uh, that's been the pattern in the past with Russia and the Soviet Union. Um, but uh, but to how shaky is his hold on power? Right now, it's very difficult to say. The population as a whole is terrorized, and I don't think we can expect mass demonstrations. But what's going on in the leadership, which will determine Putin's hold on power, that's another matter.
David, really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Jason.